Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this evening's History, Culture, and Diversity series presentation, sponsored by FLCC's Department of Social Science. We're coming to you live on WebEx, the Finger Lakes TV network, Spectrum Cable Channel 1304, and Roku, as well as fingerlakestv.org. We'll be recording this evening's presentation for the benefit of those who will not be able to join us live. I'm Dr. Robert Brown, Professor of History and organizer of the college's History, Culture, and Diversity series, which is commencing its 10th year of programming. Tonight's speaker is noted historian and award-winning author, Professor James Tobin, who is joining us from his home in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Dr. Tobin is a professor of journalism at Miami University of Ohio, where he specializes in historical and contemporary narrative nonfiction. Professor Tobin earned his BA and PhD in history at the University of Michigan. He spent 20 years as a newspaperman and freelance writer, including 12 years as a reporter with the Detroit News. His journalistic output earned him 2 nominations for the Pulitzer Prize. In 1997, Professor Tobin published Ernie, Pyle's War, America's Eyewitness to World War II. This free press title won the prestigious National Book Critics Circle Award in biography. Professor Tobin continued the World War II theme with Reporting America at War in Oral History, which he edited for Hyperion in 2003. In the same year, Professor Tobin published To Conquer Air, The Wright Brothers and the Great Race for Flight, another free press title. This book, released for the centennial of the Wrights' epic flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, received the Columbia University School of Journalism's Anthony Lucas Prize Project Award, which, quote, recognizes excellence in nonfiction that exemplifies the literary grace and commitment to serious research and social concern that characterize the works of the award's Pulitzer Prize-winning namesake, J. Anthony Lucas, unquote. This work was also selected by the Wall Street Journal as one of its 5 best books about invention. In 2021, Professor Tobin published Sing to the Colors, A Writer Explores 2 Centuries at the University of Michigan, a collection of narratives about the history of his alma mater. Tonight's presentation is based on Professor Tobin's inspirational 2013 work, The Man He Became, How FDR Defied Polio to Win the Presidency, which was published by Simon & Schuster. As you can see, this work garnered wide praise and was selected by the Christian Science Monitor as one of its best 10 books. It was also a runner-up for the 2014 Chautauqua Book Prize. It's a great honor and pleasure to introduce to you Professor James Tobin.
Thanks very much, Dr. Brown. It's really a pleasure to, even from a remote distance, be talking to folks in the Finger Lakes. I wish I was in the Finger Lakes right now. I'm stuck in the Midwest. That's a beautiful part of the country, I know. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the background of Franklin Roosevelt's struggle with polio, and then do 3 fairly short readings from my book about that story. I find that these things tend to go best when I'm in a conversation with folks who have been listening. So I really hope that you'll, as you listen to me talk and read, that you'll jot down any questions that you might have and then ask them after I'm done holding forth in this lecture format. I'd really like to have some back and forth go on. So a very strange thing has happened to the public reputation of Franklin Roosevelt since I was a kid in the 1960s. I can remember very distinctly when I was 6 or 7 years old, my grandmother, who was a music teacher in Detroit, telling me a story about a great hero who was crippled by the paralyzing disease of polio. And he heroically crossed a stage in front of a huge audience of people to make a great speech, and that it stuck in my mind as a child. And I realized pretty soon that that was a story of Franklin Roosevelt. We baby boomers knew all about polio, now almost eradicated from the globe, not quite, because we were given the polio vaccine as a kind of a new thing in the early 1960s. And we knew what it was for. And we knew that Franklin Roosevelt had polio. Um, I remember when I was working on the book, I bumped into a friend of mine, and we were talking about my research. And he said he remembered, he was about my age, he remembered coming home from school one day as a little boy and telling his mother, "Mom, I know what God looks like." And his mother said, "Jack, what do you mean? What does God look like?" And he fished in his pocket. And Dr. Brown, if you go to the next slide, and then the one after it, there, if you go to the next slide, he fished out a dime and he said, "This is a picture of God on our 10-cent coin. See, it says 'In God We Trust' right on it." And his mother said, "Well, Jack, I'm sorry, that's not God. It's just Franklin D. Roosevelt." Now, as I said, my grandmother told me this story about FDR. As a great New Deal Democrat in the 1930s and 40s, she, like other Democrats, practically equated Franklin Roosevelt with God. But that's how present the whole story of how familiar the story of FDR and polio was to us in that era. And yet, since then, I have found that the idea has grown up. And even if you're young now, if you have any notion of FDR and polio, I suspect that you share this idea that his disability was covered up. I heard this again and again when I was doing my research for this book not many years ago. People would say, "Isn't it amazing that it was all hushed up?" And in fact, I found that people not only knew about the fact that Roosevelt had been paralyzed by poliomyelitis, but that his polio was critical to his political identity. Um, he, in overcoming this disease, made what is really the greatest political comeback in American history. But it did not involve a deception, as so many people believe today. It was not a deception, but it was a kind of performance, a public performance. And so that's what I want to tell you about tonight with three short readings from my book to explain how performance was critical to FDR's rise to the White House. Next slide, please. Let me tell you what happened before FDR was struck with the disease. This is a picture of him campaigning for vice president in 1920. He had been a member of President Woodrow Wilson's cabinet during the First World War. He was successful in that role. He had been sort of clearly a rising star in Democratic Party politics. This sort of shows him in his in a typical photograph from that period when he's campaigning. You can see the sort of joy in his carriage, and if there's a hint of charisma, that's entirely fitting because that's the way he was. He was in the prime of his life the following year in 1921 when he was infected with the poliomyelitis virus. This is a tiny virus that gets into the bloodstream and moves into the nervous system. And in just a few cases, most people who get the polio virus might have a headache or might have a little bit of fever and it passes along. It doesn't get into the spinal cord, but if it does get into the spinal cord, people can suffer from varying degrees of paralysis. And if it gets into the upper parts of the nervous system, affecting the brain, it can cause death. It normally struck children, not entirely, but often enough that it was often called, especially in this period, infantile paralysis. So FDR was considered absolutely finished in politics when it became known that he was paralyzed from the waist down. Next slide, please. No one believed that he could possibly have a future in politics as a disabled man, with one exception, his closest aide and friend, a man named Louis Howe, who had been working with him for about 10 years at this point. Howe had a feeling that FDR might make a comeback. But his family, his close friends, even his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, believed that he was through in politics. But he began to do exercises to try and recover the ability to walk. Now, this is a sketch made by a friend of his in the Hudson River Valley, showing FDR working out on a contraption that he had built for himself. The man in the chair at the left is his friend Louis Howe. And he did this kind of workout both inside and outside, day after day. He was able to build back up his upper body, but he was not able to recover the use of his legs. He continued to believe that it might be possible. But he got so in 3 years, he was able to make a return to public life. So this was 1924, a presidential election year. And the two main contenders for the Democratic presidential nomination that year were a man named Robert Gibbs McAdoo from California and Alfred E. Smith, who was the very popular governor of the state of New York, your own state. Roosevelt was allied with Al Smith, and Smith needed Roosevelt on his side. Smith was the representative, the leader of the rising urban masses of the Democratic Party. This is when the city was rapidly urbanizing. And Smith was the hero of those urban, mostly immigrant, mostly Catholic people who saw him as their champion. Roosevelt, on the other hand, was an upper class, Harvard-educated man whose reputation in the sort of upper class wing of the Democratic Party, Governor Al Smith needed. He needed those folks to be on his side too. So Al Smith asked Roosevelt if he could give the nominating address at the Democratic National Convention in summer of 1924 at Madison Square Garden in New York City. FDR was nervous about it. It would be his first major public appearance since he had been paralyzed. He would not be able to walk in any way, shape, or form. But somehow he would have to stand at a rostrum, at a lectern, in the middle of thousands of people, in front of thousands of people, and give a big nominating speech. And this was in the time in our history when nominating conventions, the great national conventions of the two big parties, were a much more essential event to political campaigns than they are now. And you know how much attention they are paid now, but they are largely sort of pro forma TV shows more than anything else. In these years, critical decisions were made at the political conventions. So it was more important then than it was now. So I'm going to turn to the first reading. Dr. Brown, if you would, for a minute, show this slide. This shows FDR speaking at Madison Square Garden from just under the rostrum or stage where he was speaking. And now if you might cut back and you can just show my face as I go through the reading, my first reading here. This is about what happened on that day when he gave this speech. Roosevelt's nominating speech was scheduled for the morning of the third day of the convention, Thursday, June 26th. The streets of Manhattan were unusually quiet. People without tickets to the garden stayed inside next to their radios. FDR had arrived at the arena early, but even so, Jimmy Roosevelt, that's his oldest son, remembered, quote, "The process of getting into his seat was an ordeal for father. We had practiced the awkward business of standing together by a chair with me supporting him and taking his crutch from him. As he lowered himself into his seat, he became quite proficient at it." Roosevelt began to go about his business, moving in and out of the main hall for meetings, greeting delegates, chatting with Al Smith's lieutenants. At times he used a wheelchair. As the morning went on and the crowd grew, more and more people noticed him and pointed, and little rackets of applause began to rise whenever he came and went. It's the first time anybody had seen him in public, all knowing that he had been paralyzed. He was scheduled to speak for Smith at 10:30 in the morning, but the McAdoo forces, that's Smith's opponents, worked a switch and grabbed that time, so FDR waited. Outwardly, he was beaming, his son Jimmy said, but I could sense his inner tenseness. Finally, through the hanging pall of tobacco smoke, delegates and spectators alike could see two men lift Roosevelt by the arms and carry him up the flight of stairs from the floor to the speaker's platform. The crowd quieted down to watch. Now Roosevelt was standing at the top of the stairs. With his right hand, he held a crutch wedged under his armpit. His left hand, they saw, held the arm of a teenaged boy. "His fingers dug into my arm like pincers," Jimmy said later. "I doubt that he knew how hard he was gripping me." The heat was awful that day, and sweat was rolling down Roosevelt's neck. A moment or two more, and the crowd heard Roosevelt's name announced. Delegates fixed their eyes on the man whom they had first seen at the Democratic Convention in San Francisco 4 years earlier. In that summer of 1920, he had been, quote, "a young man in the flower of his manly vigor," as one reporter put it. At a key moment that year, he had pushed opponents aside to seize the standard of the New York delegation and rush it forward to signal praise for the stroke-stricken Democratic president, Woodrow Wilson. Soon afterward, the hall had nominated Roosevelt for vice president. Now they saw a different figure, thick in the shoulders and chest, but flimsy in the legs, the body oddly straight. He turned to the boy and took the second crutch. He started toward the lectern alone. His great friend Francis Perkins sensed a collective shiver in the hall, a sudden sorrow over this public exhibition of what had been lost. There was a hush, and everybody was just holding their breath, she remembered. The old line politicians remembered him as a very vigorous young man at the previous convention. Now, here was this terribly crippled person, getting himself to the platform somehow, looking so pale, so thin, so delicate. He reached the lectern. With both hands gripping the handles of his crutches, he could not wave. So he threw his head up and grinned. It just tore the place to pieces, Francis Perkins remembered. When the noise subsided, the voice that emerged from the weak figure on the platform was superb. It was a surprise to hear him begin to speak and see that his voice was still strong and true and vigorous, Perkins said, and that what he had to say had not only been well thought out, but was delivered in a very convincing and dramatic kind of a way. His accent and enunciation were of the high church Episcopal pulpit and the Wall Street boardroom. He said governor for governor, labor for labor. But the words were plain and blunt, and there was a note of fellow feeling that discouraged any suspicion that the speaker, however high-born, was a snob. The pace was stately, unhurried, with pauses deftly timed. Francis Perkins sat close enough to see another level of the performance. While he stood there, and while his voice was so vigorous and strong, she remembered, he was literally trembling. The hand that was on the paper was shaking because of the extreme pain and tension with which he held himself up to make that speech. Not everybody saw that, but I did. Roosevelt cited Al Smith's enormous popularity among ordinary New Yorkers. He spoke of Smith's prowess as a vote getter. This governor of ours is the most dangerous adversary that the Republican Party ever had to fear. He is the happy warrior of the political battlefield, this man of destiny whom our state proudly dedicates to the nation, our own Alfred E. Smith. In one huge burst, a reporter wrote, galleries, Smith delegates, and Smith cohorts crowding the aisles let go. From either end of the far galleries, the rising, ear-piercing shriek of fire sirens wailed high above the tumult, never to cease their unearthly yelling for an instant until more than an hour had passed. Now, afterward, the party's leaders convened backstage. Roosevelt received nearly as many congratulations as Smith himself did. He was just shaking like a leaf, Perkins recalled. He was sitting down by this time in some little room back of the stage. He sat down there and was wringing wet, perspiration streaming off his face. He was cheerful, pleasant, smiling, but he was weak as a rag. Eleanor Roosevelt and her friend, Caroline O'Day, associate chair of the New York State Democratic Committee, had scheduled a reception that evening for the New York delegation at Roosevelt's mother's house on East 65th Street. With Sarah Roosevelt, another very important person in FDR's life at this stage, and every stage. Eleanor's friend, Marion Dickerman, left the convention early and ran uptown to help with the party. When she got to the house, Sarah Roosevelt's butler told her that Mr. Roosevelt was resting upstairs and would like to speak to her for a moment. She ran up and found FDR sitting up in his bed. He stretched his arms wide and said, "Marion, I did it." Okay. Now to the next slide, please. Oh, then the one after that. There we are. Now, Al Smith did not win that election. He was not to be elected president. But FDR, because of that speech, was now back on the map, politically speaking. And many Democrats, especially in the state of New York, kept asking, can he run for office? Is he ready? Is it possible that he will recover the ability to walk so that he can run again? He would be instantly elected to whatever office he ran for. It was taken for granted by everybody from Roosevelt to his political friends to the voting public that he would be able to run for office only if he could recover his ability to stand up and walk on his own. So he began to pursue other options for recovering the strength of his legs. And he found a special warm water resort in the middle of Georgia. It was called Warm Springs. These are springs, mineral springs, like the ones at Saratoga Springs, not too far from you all, that provide to many people a sense of reinvigoration. There's a lot of disagreement about whether it actually has a medicinal effect. But Roosevelt believed that it did. And he was enchanted by the waters in the swimming pools at Warm Springs. And he actually bought the resort and began to turn it into a center for the treatment of polio patients. So he began to go there himself for his own treatments for many weeks out of every year. He did make some progress in the water with his exercises. He did gain some greater ability, not to walk on his own, but to maneuver better with braces, with a crutch. Then he could discard the crutch and get along simply by making sure his braces were locked and then holding braces on his legs, that is, and then holding tightly to the arm of an assistant. So this suspense went on all through these years, 1925, 1926, 1927. Roosevelt could not still walk on his own. But again, the politicians in New York State were pressuring him and his allies to see if he could run for governor that year, because now Al Smith had not won the nomination in 1924, but he was going to be a shoo-in for the nomination in 1928. He was going to be going up against a very a popular Republican nominee, Herbert Hoover, who had been Secretary of the Treasury for a number of years. And Al Smith realized that if he was going to have a chance against Hoover, he must carry his home state of New York. And to do that, he would need a strong candidate for governor running alongside him on the Democratic ticket. And Roosevelt was by far the largest name, the most popular candidate who could run for governor that year in 1928. Roosevelt and his assistant, Louis Howe, his chief advisor, believed that Smith would lose, that Herbert Hoover would win the White House, and that if Smith went down in the election, so would the nominee for governor. Roosevelt could not walk yet, but felt that more time at Warm Springs might help him fully recover. But Smith and his people were saying, look, it's now or never. You must run this year. You must help your friend, Al Smith. And so Roosevelt reluctantly agreed to be nominated. He had 3 weeks in which to campaign. We think of Kamala Harris's campaign being extremely truncated and brief, but it was much longer than what Roosevelt had that fall of 1928 to run for governor. He was going to have to run without being able to walk. So now I'm going to go to my second reading and tell you what happened during that campaign. Roosevelt's physical performance was going to be the real message of his campaign. And so the campaign now exhibited the candidate from one end of the state of New York to the other. He raced across the southern tier of Republican farm counties, up to Buffalo, and then to Rochester. This is right in your neighborhood, where people lined the sidewalks to see the cavalcade roll into town, and where 800 stood in line to shake his hand at the Seneca Hotel. That night, October 21st, with 2 weeks until the election, before a crowd of 4,000 in the Rochester Convention Hall, where he had been nominated 3 weeks earlier, FDR placed the issue of his disability squarely on the table. From their seats, people could see precisely what he was: a tall, good-looking man who stood perfectly straight, not bent or bowed, and who moved with a slow, swaying gait, one hand with the cane, the other hand on an aide's arm. They saw him cross the stage, then drop into a heavy armchair, fiddle for an instant with the braces under his trouser legs, and bend his knees. They saw him listen as others spoke, tossing his head with laughter, and then when his turn came, he got to his feet with an aide's help, quote, and they had not failed to notice the smile on his face, said a reporter. For several days, he had been choosing his topics as any other candidate would. He had talked about Al Smith, about his Republican opponent, Albert Ottinger, about the use of the state's rivers for the public good, and about prohibition. But now he said he would speak about a new issue. He said he wished to speak about his plan to do more for the 100,000 New Yorkers who were disabled and unable to pay for the treatments that might help them recover their mobility. I may be pardoned, he said now, the smile gone, if I refer to my own intense interest in the care of crippled children, and indeed of cripples of every kind. At this, people began to rise to their feet and applaud. The reporter from the New York World heard women begin to cry. Roosevelt waited for the noise to subside and then went on. People readily recognize that I myself furnish a perfectly good example of what can be done by the right kind of care. The cheers resumed. I dislike to use this personal example, but I do so because it fits. 7 years ago, through an attack of infantile paralysis, I was completely put out of any useful activity. And now one woman was sobbing audibly. By personal good fortune, I was able to get the best kind of medical care The result is that today I am on my feet. And now the applause was making it impossible to hear him, and his smile came back, assured, triumphant. I am on my feet, he repeated, and entirely capable, at least from the physical point of view, of running any business, whether a private business or that of the government of the state of New York. With the deftest touch, he was learning to use his disability to his advantage. He must not seem to be asking for votes on the basis of pity. That would be disastrous. But he could instead show himself to be something he had never been seen as before, a fighter, and better yet, an underdog, not a man to pity, not a man to envy, but a man to cheer. Well, Roosevelt won that election, barely. And then in 1929, the Great Depression hit the nation. This was a time of terrible economic trouble, with 1 out of 4 people out of work, the banking system under extreme stress, the whole economy seeming to come down around the nation's shoulders. What that meant was that the Republican candidate, Herbert Hoover, was going to be in very difficult shape when the next election for president came around in 1932. Roosevelt was reelected to the governorship in 1930. It was just a 2-year term then. And he became a leading prospect for the Democratic nomination. He ran for president. He campaigned in 1932, just as he had in 1928, as I just described, running all over the nation, showing himself, showing his physical vigor, even though he could not walk on his own. And he won the election. And so now comes Inauguration Day, 1932. This happened to be the very worst week, the absolute depth of the Great Depression. The banks were literally failing all across the country that day. And so I decided to start the book with this moment, capturing him at his inaugural address on the steps of the Capitol. And so, Dr. Brown, I wonder if you'd go to that next slide here. And another one. And one more. This reading, as I say, is right at the beginning of the book. It's the beginning of the prologue. March 4th, 1933, Capitol. Franklin D. Roosevelt sat in a plain chair waiting to be summoned to the chamber of the United States Senate. It was 11:30 in the morning on the day of his inauguration as President of the United States. At noon, he was to watch his running mate, John Nance Garner of Texas, take the oath as Vice President, and then FDR would walk outside for his own swearing in at 1 o'clock. He was waiting in the room reserved for the Senate's Committee on Military Affairs. Several assistants sat with him, among them his eldest son, James, always called Jimmy, 26 years old, brawny, and an inch or two taller than his father. At 10 minutes to noon, someone looked in and said they were ready for him in the Senate. Roosevelt hitched himself to the edge of his chair, placed his hands on his thighs, and pushed until his legs were straight out in front of him. He felt through the fabric of his trousers for metal locks on the custom-made braces that encased both of his legs. Then he snapped the locks shut so that his knees would not buckle when he rose. Jimmy stood and faced him. Father and son grasped each other by the arms, and with a quick heave, the elder Roosevelt rocked up onto his feet and straightened at the waist. With one hand, he grasped a wooden cane. With the other, he held Jimmy's arm. Under his trousers, the bars and cuffs and belts of his braces held his legs rigid from his heels to his buttocks. His cane, his son, and his own stiffly braced lower body formed the 3 legs of a reasonably stable tripod. Slowly, they moved across the room and into the corridor, and there Colonel Edward Halsey, Secretary of the Senate, met them and held up his hand. And Halsey said he was very sorry, but the Senate wasn't quite ready after all. So Jimmy and his father stopped, pivoted, and ambulated back into the Military Affairs Committee room. At the chair, Roosevelt pivoted again, set down his cane, gripped his son, and lowered himself onto the seat, legs locked straight in front. He reached behind his knees, undid the locks, pulled his knees up, hitched himself backward, and rested his hands on the arms of the chair, ready to tighten his grip if he began to tilt and fall to the floor. I emphasize the details there to show what Roosevelt had to go through every time he wanted to do nothing more difficult for most of us than to simply stand up and walk and then sit down again. After 10 more minutes, the Senate was ready. Jimmy stood, Roosevelt pushed his legs down and locked the braces, father and son heaved, and he was standing again. They moved across the room and into the corridor where members of the Committee on Arrangements waited to escort him. A voice ahead of him was announcing, "The President-elect of the United States." Then he was inside the brilliantly lit chamber. Senators, congressmen, the justices of the Supreme Court, the military chiefs, members of the diplomatic corps, his children, his mother, his wife in a purple-blue gown holding an enormous bouquet of violets, all were looking at him. Jimmy escorted him to a new chair, and there, between President Herbert Hoover, whom Roosevelt had just defeated in the November election, and Senator Joseph Taylor Robinson of Arkansas, leader of the new Democratic majority, Roosevelt sat again, unlocked the braces, pulled up his knees, and lightly grasped the arms of the chair. He listened as 15 new senators and the new vice president were sworn in, and then the Senate chaplain, the Reverend Zabarny Thorne Phillips, rector of Washington's Episcopal Church of the Epiphany, asked the assembly to rise for prayer. Every one of the hundreds of people in the Senate chamber stood up, except the president-elect. A reporter in the press gallery saw Roosevelt lean forward for an instant, as if by instinct, then he settled back. Senator Robinson, next to him, now standing, glanced down at Roosevelt. Robinson was hardly known for his courtliness. He had once been suspended from the Chevy Chase Country Club for punching a fellow golfer on the 15th green. But at this moment, he did something, as another watching reporter put it, quote, that should win him a golden mark on the Manual of Gentlemen. He dropped to his seat beside the president-elect. Everyone else in the room remained standing for the prayer. The moment came to move outside for the presidential oath of office and the inaugural address. The Capitol's corridors filled with people, the crowd jammed up at the great door that opened onto the Capitol's East Plaza. Roosevelt stood behind Herbert Hoover and waited. His bulky upper body pressed down on the joints of his knees, holding himself upright, was a concerted act of strength and balance. Then Jimmy and he, now in top hats, were out the door into cold gray daylight under lowering clouds, moving slowly down a long ramp that led to the speaker's platform and the lectern itself. Members of the Hoover administration, Roosevelt's own new cabinet secretaries, and members of Congress walked in a close-packed formation around him. 100,000 people were watching. 12,000 were seated. The rest stood in a crowd that spread across the plaza and East Capitol Drive and up the front steps of the Supreme Court and the Library of Congress and into the branches of the surrounding trees. 100 press photographers straight in front of him clicked their shutters. Newsreel cameras whirred. Roosevelt moved toward them all with a slow, swaying gait. Jimmy next to him, swaying in rhythm with his father. The procession blocked the crowd's view of anything but Roosevelt's shoulders and head. But if Jimmy and he had been walking alone, people would have noticed that with each step he leaned a bit to one side, while on the opposite side he hitched his shoulder just enough to swing the leg on that side forward. The coordinated movements of the shoulder and the leg were smooth and almost simultaneous. Anyone who saw his gait could see that he was crippled, but with help, he was walking. He reached the lectern, grasped it with one hand, set down his cane, and removed his top hat. Jimmy moved a few steps back. Roosevelt swiveled to face Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes. With his hand, he gripped the lectern. As Hughes read the words of the oath, beginning, "Do you, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, solemnly swear?" Roosevelt held up his right hand. When Hughes completed the question, Roosevelt lowered his right hand to the Dutch Bible that had been in his family since the 17th century. Breaking precedent, he did not, after Justice Hughes posed the question of the oath, simply say, "I do." Instead, he recited the entire oath, holding the lectern with his left hand, resting his right on the first page of Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians. For most of his life, he had hoped to become president. For 12 years, he had prepared for the task he had just performed, walking to this lectern before an enormous audience and standing upright to take the oath of office. The performance had been the culminating and indispensable act of the great struggle of his life. It was not an act of deception. He was not trying to fool anyone into thinking he was not crippled. Anyone who read the newspapers knew that. Rather, it was a deliberate show of strength, a silent, symbolic assertion that he could bear the burden of the presidency. Okay. Thanks for being patient with my reading. I want to show you one little video clip of Roosevelt just about this time doing the sort of walking that I just described. The clip is very brief. Roosevelt did not want to be shown in a motion picture walking as he is shown here. But he did walk so that the people who were in the right in the vicinity could see him. Dr. Brown, if you'll raise that now. This happened just a couple of months after this the walk to the podium that I just described. Okay, now Robert, if you go back and show that again, just that same clip, watch closely. You can see this swaying motion. Cane in his right hand, holding the Secret Service agent's arm with his left. Okay, pause that for a second. What happened there was that Secret Service came and shut down the video camera of the man who was taking that film. The Secret Service knew that Roosevelt did not want to be videotaped, and so they asked people to put their cameras away. But then the man resumed at this point, and you'll see in a moment how Roosevelt, although it shows him from the shoulders up, is pulling himself backward into his car seat. And you can see him fiddling with something. You get the sense that he's doing something with his hands. Go ahead and show it, Robert. Oh, take it back just 10 seconds. There he is. He pushes himself back. His arms are extended. He's fiddling with those braces so that he can sit in the car. That's Eleanor Roosevelt. As I say, this was an affair over at Vassar College. And just an amateur photographer taking these clips from up close. And we'll see one more shot of FDR and his famous smile. Eleanor's famous smile, too. And there they go, raising his famous campaign hat. Okay, that's good. Thank you. Okay. So I wanted you to see that clip, partly because it's this rare image of Roosevelt actually standing and walking with assistance, and get a sense of just how difficult it was for him to do that. He didn't walk like that very much. He did it when he had to make that public performance. Otherwise, when he was moving from place to place, he was in a wheelchair, pushed by either Secret Service or assistants or members of his family. And that's how he got around. In the White House, he would be taken into the Oval Office or whatever office or room he was using in the wheelchair. And then he would make a shift. He could do it himself, but he often had assistance, from wheelchair to a comfortable chair, often with strong arms that he could grasp if he needed to keep himself from falling over. Okay, that's what I prepared, and I hope, as I said at the beginning, that you all have some questions that you might want to ask.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Tobin. So we now can invite questions from the audience. If you want to speak, please click the raise hand icon, which is in the lower right-hand part of your screen. And when I see it, I can recognize you, unmute your microphone, and you can pose your question directly to Dr. Tobin. Otherwise, feel free to type something in the chat, which is in the lower right-hand corner, all the way at the sort of bottom right-hand edge. And I'll try to see it and read it to Professor Tobin. Let's open things up.
I see that question.
Okay.
What role did Delano Roosevelt play in his winning his election? It's a very good question. She, of course, was a major figure in her own right, probably the most well-known, the most influential first lady in our history. It is often said by people who don't really know the story that she was the more ambitious of the two, and that she prodded FDR into trying to recover after he contracted polio and run for office. That is really not the case at all. She thought that he ought to stay active in politics in the sense of knowing what was going on, perhaps playing a role behind the scenes. But she did not believe in the early years of his recovery that he could ever run for office again. But she dedicated herself to his recovery, to helping him however she could in the first couple of years. She had nurses training herself, and so she was literally his nurse for some time. And then in 1928, and especially in 1932, she had determined at a certain point that she was not going to try and influence his decision about whether to run for high office or not. So, and by the same token, they had an agreement whereby he would not try to influence her one way or the other in her activities. In the 1920s, she became a force in Democratic politics, especially in New York State. Played a very active role in Al Smith's campaigns, and then, of course, in her husband's campaigns. So she was a critical figure, but she was not the person who had the ambition in the family for high office. FDR had more than enough of that on his own.
It looks like we have a couple hands up. Skip, do you want to pose the question?
After his first time as president, did his health deteriorate even more? And how healthy was he up until the end?
Yeah. Oh, great question. Great question. So FDR, after the polio virus, was out of his system, he was perfectly healthy in the sense of, his mind was healthy, his organs were healthy, everything worked fine except for his legs. He just couldn't walk. So he was really, and he continued to be very active, as I've said. So his basic health was very good all through his governorship and all through certainly the first two terms of his presidency from 1933 until 1941. Of course, he ran for an unprecedented third term in 1940 and was reelected. It's fair to say that he was well enough then to run for a third term, but he was starting to suffer from pretty significant heart disease. And by the time he ran for a fourth term in 1944, he was deathly ill. This had probably nothing at all to do with polio. It's conceivable that he had what is called post-polio syndrome, which is a kind of recurrence of weakness in the originally affected limbs. But he wasn't trying to use those limbs much during World War II anyway. It was his heart that was the problem. That was the great difficulty. I believe he should not have run for president in 1944. It was an irresponsible decision. And he died, of course, only a couple of months after he took the oath of office in early 1944. Harry Truman became president. We're lucky that Truman was the one who became president, who rose to the White House, because he himself became a fine president in his own right. But Roosevelt was not healthy in the last couple of years of his life.
Thank you.
And much of that was undoubtedly due to the strain of navigating the U.S. through the greatest total war in its history. Professor,
That's absolutely right. I mean, his doctor said the only chance you have, this was very private information, the only chance you have of living, for more than another year or two is if you can somehow banish stress from your life. Well, obviously that was absolutely impossible. So running for president again was a death sentence, essentially.
right. Dr. Canos has a question in the chat. Did FDR's personal experience with polio influence how he tried to shepherd the U.S. through the Depression? The compassionate Roosevelt that we get in the New Deal, how much of that was conditioned by his own personal suffering?
Well, it's a great question, and I believe the answer is that he was deeply affected in his approach to the presidency by the suffering that he had gone through. Roosevelt was a person who had everything handed to him. He was born into a wealthy family. He was an extraordinarily attractive and gifted man. He went to Harvard. His first job was handed to him because his mother knew the head of a great New York law firm, and then he was basically asked to join Woodrow Wilson's cabinet. I mean, it was just he was on greased skids until polio hit, and so he had never been tempered. He'd never been tested. The extraordinary thing is that his character showed through once he was faced with this enormous ordeal. He showed who he really was. I don't think he himself really knew who he was until he went through this great ordeal. Then he becomes president in the midst of great national suffering. And see, I mean, there's no way to quantify it. We can't do a brain scan that shows, a greater degree of compassion. But people said that the arrogance that he had as a young man was gone, that a sense of humility, and as I say, just simple compassion for suffering was now a part of his character. And so it's impossible not to see that take effect during his presidency. Another thing is, people who have studied the New Deal or read about the New Deal may know that it was an improvised affair. It was not that FDR came to office with a clear ideology about what he wanted to do. He said, we're going to try new things. And if one thing doesn't work, we're going to try another thing. And if that doesn't work, we'll try a third. It is uncanny how close that is to the way he approached his recovery from polio. He tried one method after another, and when one didn't work, he tried the next one. That became his habit. He was an improviser, and we see that all through the New Deal, certainly, and to a certain extent, even during his leadership of the Allied war effort in World War II.
Thanks. Do you see the comment in the chat from?
I missed that.
Gosh, let's see. That once FDR became president, in what ways did he promote legislation to support the disabled community within the U.S.?
Well, that's a good question. He did do a significant amount for the disabled in the state of New York. And he tried as best he could to support the disabled in special provisions of New Deal programs. So it did sort of become a part of American politics during the New Deal, and FDR obviously was responsible for that. Now, you cannot say that anything like later American, what am I thinking of? The ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, sponsored first by George H.W. Bush, came about in the early 1990s. Nothing like that was undertaken. The position of the disabled in the 1930s was far, far different than it is today, or than it has been in recent decades. But the early strides toward recognizing the special needs of the disabled certainly came about during the New Deal.
Thank you. And Mary Fitzgerald, sorry, you've been very patient. Would you like to present your question to Professor Tobin? There we go.
Okay, sorry, it took a second to connect. So I did actually have a connection and kind of a question that's relevant to the area that we live in. Earlier, Professor Tobin, am I saying that correctly?
Yes, you are.
Okay, you mentioned that FDR had spent time at a healing spring in Georgia. Are you familiar with the Glen Healing Springs in Watkins Glen?
No, I am not. Tell me about it.
So I grew up in Watkins Glen, and over the summer I hiked some of the Finger Lakes trails and actually discovered where some of the old they're like stone structures up behind the gorge. I'm not sure if you've ever been there, but when I did a little bit of research, I found out that sometime in the early 1900s it was used for healing springs. And in the 1940s and 50s it was deemed what's the word, like it wasn't seen as a real medical
Yeah.
route.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I had not heard about that, and it's funny that I never saw in Roosevelt's papers in his library, all of his letters and documents and so forth. I never saw him refer to mineral springs at Watkins Glen, but what you're describing sounds exactly like that. And structures would be built around ponds or pools where the mineral waters were. As I say, these mineral springs are apparent. I've never been in one. They're quite common in Germany and a couple of other parts of Europe. And as I say, Saratoga Springs has them. There are other parts of the U.S. where they are. They're apparently they're wonderful to get into and swim in, bathe in. They feel great. There are these little tiny bubbles that break against your skin, and they do create, there's no doubt, greater buoyancy than you'll feel in a regular lake or pool or the ocean or a swimming pool. That was what was so great about the pool at Warm Springs, is that for polio patients, they could exercise their legs because the water was more buoyant and held them up. They could move their legs and walk, across the bottom of the swimming pool in a way that was great for them. But the waters themselves apparently do not have any particular medicinal power. So I bet what you discovered, what you found, was somebody saying that at a certain point those springs were not used in this way because doctors had declared, look, this really isn't a medical use. It's not really going to help people. And there was controversy about this because doctors would say, oh yes, it does help. Others would say, no, it doesn't. And so there was a danger that doctors who recommended these kinds of springs would be seen as perpetrating a fraud. So really interesting that Watkins Glen has that. I'll have to look that up and find out more about it. I'm really interested in what you say.
If you search up on Google Padua, it's Padua, that facility.
Padua. I'll look that up.
That facility used to be used a long time ago as a resort for wealthier people to go to.
Yeah.
And they ended up demolishing the building. There's still remnants of the structures up on the hill in Watkins, but I thought it was really cool because I had never heard anything about it before.
Yeah, that's really cool. Thanks for mentioning it.
No problem. Thank you.
Thanks. We have a question in the chat by Maxwell Bodell about Why are many people today, under the impression that Roosevelt's condition was covered up? That does seem to be a pretty pervasive and persistent myth, doesn't it?
Yeah, no question about it. So I think the reasons are complicated. It is true that Roosevelt discouraged photographers and, as I say, videographers from taking pictures or movies that would show him in awkward positions, or especially in the case of the video, that would show him walking. And the reason is there was a great danger, and this happened often enough, there was a great danger of him falling. He did not want to be captured on film falling down. He knew that he was strong enough to do the job. But he also knew that if he were pictured that way and it got into the newspapers, his opponents would use it to say, look, see, he really is disabled. He is not able to carry out the functions of the presidency. And you have to understand something. The stigma of disability in the 1930s, 1920s was so much greater than it is today. People were stared at in public, even in wheelchairs. It was thought to be shameful to have a physical disability. Many people with polio in that era were shut away in their own families' homes. This was true of children. It was true of adults, or in institutions. They were not allowed to have jobs that they might otherwise have had because there was a great deal of shame attached to disability. Roosevelt had sort of pulled off this amazing, as I say, this amazing performance, not to try to convince people that this had never happened to him and that he was as able-bodied as anybody who had never suffered an attack like this. That wasn't his aim, but he also knew that if it became too visible, that his enemies would use it against him, and that some people would think, look, the guy really is, it's not just that he had polio, like he's still like he's in a wheelchair. And that was seen as a great mark of weakness and shame. So he took these steps that some historians have said have exaggerated, journalists especially have exaggerated, as if to say he covered the whole thing up. And then there was an influential book published in that late 1980s by a man named Hugh Gregory Gallagher, who had polio himself, a not very well-researched book that points out some of these practices that FDR followed. And the book was titled FDR's Splendid Deception. Well, that title sort of got into the bloodstream of people's thinking about FDR. I think that had a big influence too. And, I think that the cynicism of our thinking about politics in recent decades has crept into this conversation too. People assume that presidents hide and cover up. This is a long legacy that began with Watergate in the 1970s and Richard Nixon, that secrets are held, that scandals are covered up, and that this was FDR's scandal that he was trying to hide. And like many things, it's a subtle business, because there were ways in which he tried to, I would say, tamp down the public perception of his disability. But that's a very different thing than saying that he actually tried to cover the whole thing up. I don't think my book has made much difference in trying to get rid of this myth, because it's definitely still out there. But if you look at the evidence, that's the thing. I said, okay, well, what did he do? Did he cover it up or not? And here you find you don't even have to look in his private papers, just to look in the public press. It's all over the place. Everybody knew that he had polio. Everybody knew that he was that he could not walk by himself. So the evidence was plain. That's what historians are supposed to do. Look at the evidence. What does the evidence say? Did he cover it up or not? So that's what I tried to show.
Now, while his disability was not a liability, he was tremendously fortunate in becoming president at a time when radio is coming of age. Isn't that true? Where, he's invisible to his audience, which numbered in the millions. I mean, I've done some work in this regard, and his fireside chats drew audiences that equaled the Jack Benny show, the most popular entertainment programs. And here, the sheer artistry of his words, the force of his personality, comes full on through that loudspeaker.
Oh, I couldn't say it any better than that. I mean, this was FDR's great strength. He has this beautiful voice. I made a point or two in the readings about how well he spoke. And so think of that too. You are sitting in your own living room and you are listening to the voice of the President of the United States. And, radio was still fairly new at this time. And it had been used for political broadcasts before, but never with the intimacy that FDR, in the way that FDR used it. He did not call these fireside chats. That was a name given to these conversations by others because they seemed so intimate. And so you're listening to this rich, mature, intelligent voice talking to you over the radio. You're not thinking this guy's in a wheelchair while he's saying these words. He seems like your beloved uncle, and so I think that helped to dispel any lingering image people had of him being essentially a disabled man.
Thank you. And we're sort of need to wrap things up. We're close to the end, but there is a question in the chat about when FDR holding fire drills in the White House, where he would have to drag himself out of bed without assistance. Is that true? Is there any?
That's a little bit of a misunderstanding. FDR had a great fear of fire for that very reason. He knew that he would have great difficulty getting out of a burning building. And although this is not for sure, it was said in his family, and I don't know if it's true, that when he was a boy, he was witness to a relative of his, an aunt, I think, or possibly a cousin, who was in the house they were in caught fire, and he saw her descend a staircase with her clothing on fire, and that had traumatized him. And that created a fear of fire. So what it meant was that he could never be alone. That was one of the difficulties of his life, that you think any of us can get off by ourselves, right? We can go somewhere by ourselves. We can go out in the woods by ourselves, which FDR loved to do, by the way, before he was disabled. Or we can go sit in a house by ourselves. FDR did not have that luxury, so that he made sure that there was always assistance nearby. He did not do, as far as I know, he never took part in a fire drill where he himself crawled out of a room or out of a house. That didn't happen. At least I'm not aware of it. Now, he could drag himself by his elbows, and he could hitch himself along on the floor, crab style, pushing himself backward with his bottom on the floor. He practiced those things, but those were more matters of exercise than for his upper body than to actually take part in a fire drill.
And just one more thing, you talked, you discussed in your book, and you referenced here, the famous inaugural address, so quotable and memorable. It must be more than a coincidence that, after saying, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance.
I know that word. I mean, it's just right there in front of your face, right? And he wrote that speech. So yeah, and he understood the paralyzing effects of fear, and he had overcome them. And so it's lovely that those words are used in that address, because that was exactly what was happening to the country. So yeah, I'm so glad you pointed that out. That's quite right.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time tonight, and for everybody for joining us. I'd like to invite everybody back on October 22nd, 7 o'clock, another WebEx presentation. Dr. Matthew Restall, professor of history and director of Latin American Studies at Penn State, will present Discovering the Myth History of Columbus, Montezuma, and a Belizean Battle. So thanks again, everybody.
Sounds good. Thanks a lot.
Dr. Tobin.